All right, and it's 6 o'clock, so I start on time. Those of people who have been my students, they know that. That's the way that I roll. So let's go ahead and get started. First of all, welcome you all. I want to just thank you guys for being here, for watching this. I think it's going to be a really good hour. We'll spend about an hour or so discussing the solar eclipse. Couple little things. First of all, to our YouTube audience who has subscribed to us in the past, today is actually a huge milestone. We hit 1,000 subscribers today, which is awesome. I just want to thank you if you're a subscriber. Thank you for doing that. I really appreciate it. I've been growing this channel and trying to with the help of the employees here at RMSP, and it's going so well. So I really, really appreciate your support and for subscribing. Thank you. With that said, I'm going to be monitoring comments. I am also going to be teaching, so I may not see your comment, and I apologize about that. But Sarah and I are going to do our best to do that. If you're not watching this live and you're watching it after it's been recorded, I will also be doing my best to answer comments after the fact. So feel free to ask any questions you may have, and I'll get my best at answering them as quickly as possible. So let's go ahead and get started. For those of you who don't know, there's a big solar eclipse. I guess it's not a big solar eclipse. All solar eclipses are big. It's a full solar eclipse happening on August 21st of this year that's going to stretch across most of the United States. It's pretty darn cool. So most people can drive 3, 4, 5 hours and get to see the total solar eclipse. I think it's an awesome opportunity, and I want to talk a little bit about that. Now, before we get into how to actually do it, let me go ahead and switch over here to my presentation. I want to first talk about what you can actually expect to photograph, because a lot of people hear the hype. They're like, oh, cool, it's a solar eclipse, but what can you actually get? What can you expect to shoot? So I want to go through some photos. Now, I didn't shoot any of these, and as a full disclaimer, I have not actually personally photographed a solar eclipse, but I am an avid astrophotographer, and I also got my degree in physics from the University of Montana, so I feel like I'm well qualified to help you guys get some good eclipse photos, and I will be shooting this one for sure. So here are some cool images. This one is taken during totality, which is a phase of the eclipse that we'll talk about in a little bit. Here's a cool composite image, and again, the copyright for who shot these is in the lower left. I didn't take any of these. It's a cool composite image. Here's another shot from totality where you can see the sun's corona around the outside of the sun. Very, very cool. This one's one of my favorites. This was one of the astronomy photos of the day a few years ago. The planning that went into this shot, really, really cool. Really love this one. This one's super cool. We've got a wide field thing set up with a nice wide angle lens. For those of you who have multiple cameras, if you plan on shooting the eclipse, I definitely would try shooting something like this. If you have a second camera, just set it up on a tripod and shoot away. You can get some pretty cool stuff. Now, let's take a look here, and let's take a look at what actually is a solar eclipse. Because again, I think we have that whole hype train thing where a lot of people are like, yeah, let's shoot this thing, and they don't actually know what it is. So the nerd in me compels me to tell you what a solar eclipse is. So bear with me here, okay? First of all, a solar eclipse happens when the sun's light is blocked from hitting the Earth by the moon. We all know the moon is orbiting around the Earth, and every once in a while, it just happens perfectly that the sun and the moon and the Earth are in perfect alignment, and all of the sun's light is blocked by the moon. It's super, super cool. And what's even cooler is that in the world, it just so happens that the sun and the moon take up equal portions of the sky. So when they align, it's a perfect match between the sizes of the two. So you can get just such spectacular views that happen. All right. Now, a couple little pieces of terminology that we're going to use throughout. First of all, the area of the Earth that's in the full shadow of the moon, so the sun is being blocked by the moon, is called the umbra, or the umbral shadow is that little region. And this is where a total solar eclipse can occur. So this is that part of the United States called the path of totality you may have seen, and it's a super great place. If you live in the path of totality or you're going to travel there, that's where the best views will be found. Now, the area in partial shadow is called the penumbra, and this is where you can see a partial eclipse. So that doesn't mean that the moon is going to completely block the sun, but it will block part of it, which is super, super cool. And here's a little chart to kind of show you what's going on, a little diagram. We can see the sun on the left, the Earth on the right, and the moon in the middle. And you can see that tiny little band where those two light rays meet. That little band right there on the Earth, that's the umbral shadow. And we just so happen that we're so lucky this eclipse that stretches across the United States, those of us in the US. Now, eclipses happen quite often, but the big deal about this one is that is so close to home for us who live in the US, which is super cool. Now, we need to talk a little bit about this. I want to look at what's required for the sun to eclipse, because there's some interesting things that are required in order for that to work. There's really two major things that have to happen. The first is that from the perspective of a viewer, of someone sitting on the Earth, the moon and the sun have got to be perfectly aligned. If they're off at all, you won't have a full eclipse, meaning the entire sun will not be blocked by the moon. The one on August 21st, for the path of totality, is meeting that criteria. The second thing, and this is even more important, most people think that the Earth and the moon orbits in a perfect circle, but it actually doesn't. The moon's orbit is actually slightly oval. It's slight oval to it, meaning it has closer points and further points in its orbital path. The moon actually has to be in one of its closest parts of its orbit in order to be large enough, and again, it doesn't change size, but it's closer, so it looks larger, to be large enough to completely block the sun. All right, and that's pretty cool. It's called perigee, which is the closest point of an orbit. Pretty darn awesome. Now, if neither of these factors are true, you'll be left with a few different things. You could either have an annular eclipse, which is something that we'll look at in a little bit, a partial eclipse, which is what most of the United States will get, those people who are not in the path of totality, or you'll have no eclipse at all, which is obviously the most common thing and what most of us have all the time, what most of us live around. All right. Now, with that said, let's get into talking about the types of solar eclipses, what there are, different types, because there's really three major types of eclipse. The first is a partial eclipse. Now, a partial eclipse is when the moon only partially covers up the sun, okay? This is the type you can expect if you're in the penumbral shadow, not the umbral shadow, but the little bit outside. So the moon's kind of covering up the sun, but not completely. And most, if not all, of the US, and actually quite a bit of the rest of the world, is going to be able to see at least a partial eclipse on August 21st. And here's a view you can expect of that. This is an actual photo of a partial eclipse, and you can see the sun and the moon partially occluding that. You kind of get a crescent sun. Pretty darn cool. It's pretty sweet. So that's a partial eclipse. Now, let's move on to an annular eclipse. So an annular eclipse happens when the moon is perfectly aligned with the sun, but the moon is not at its perigee or its closest point in its orbit. It's a little further out, which means it's not quite large enough in the sky to completely cover the sun. And what happens is you get a little ring. You get the sun in the background, the moon covering up the inner portion, but not the whole thing. And this is actually pretty cool. Unfortunately, not unfortunately, I'd rather have a total eclipse, but this is not going to be something that happens on the 21st. This does happen quite often, but on the 21st, the moon will be close enough that it will completely block it out. All right, continuing along. Total eclipse. This is the cool one, in my opinion. So in a total eclipse, the viewer is located directly in the umbral shadow, so everything's aligned, and the sun is, or not the sun, the moon is at its closest point in its orbit, so it can completely block out the sun. The result is that the sun is completely occluded by the moon, okay? This is the rarest type of eclipse because so much needs to go true. Actually, I don't know that it's the rarest. Annular may be just as rare, but it's one of the kind of most sought after types of eclipses, okay? And the cool thing is, we have one of these happening in August. That's what we're going to have if you live in that path of totality. And again, here's a photo of that. You can see the beautiful corona around the outside of the sun, all that detail, that filamentary structure. It's gorgeous. Okay? Now, where can you see one? Well, if you're unsure, here's a map of the United States, and that little dark band stretching across it, that is the path of totality. So again, let me break this down for you. If you live or plan on traveling to that little dark band, you will see, assuming it's clear, a total solar eclipse, meaning you'll see the corona, you'll see all of that detail. If instead you live elsewhere in the United States and you don't want to travel, you'll at least see a partial eclipse, which is still pretty darn cool. So really I would say, regardless of where you live, look outside. It's going to be awesome. Now, eclipses happen fairly often. People actually think that it's super rare. People have been talking about how rare the August 21st one is. The reason it's so rare is because they rarely will pass across an entire country. Usually they happen in the middle of the ocean or different random places in the world. It's a big deal for it to be in the US. For those of us who live here, it hasn't done this, it hasn't crossed across the US in a very, very long time. I think about 100 years. All right, so that's pretty awesome. But if you live in the US and not on that band, you'll still get something partial. It'll still be a really pretty view. Now, we've talked about what they are. We've talked about what they'll look like. Now I want to talk a little bit about what it will be like when it actually happens. So let's walk through the steps from the very beginning to the very end. Now we have someone asking, Ken is asking, will we see the total eclipse anywhere in the dark band? Yes, you will. So Ken, if you live anywhere in that path of totality or you're traveling there, you will see a total eclipse, assuming that it's obviously clear skies and you can see the sky and all that kind of stuff. But yes, if you're in that dark band, total eclipse, awesome. Now, what will it be like when the eclipse happens? We got to break it into phases. So you can kind of break the eclipse up into 5 main stages. First thing I should say, before and after the eclipse, the sun is no different than it is right now. I mean, you could go outside and look at the sun, and the sun looks the same right now as it will right before the eclipse starts. There's no real special thing that happens with this. But let's talk about this. The first step is what's called first contact. And this is the first stage of the eclipse. And it's when the moon just starts to occlude the sun. So as soon as the moon starts to block a little bit of the sun's light, boom, that's what we call first contact, okay? The sun looks as though a portion of it's missing, and first contact, it touches, then the sun continues to move behind the moon. I should say, very important, if you want to photograph or view first contact, you need filtration, whether that's for your camera or your eyeballs or whatever it might be. You need some form of filtration to safely look at this, all right? Now, second contact is once the sun has moved completely behind the moon and it just touches the other side, so it's now moved completely behind. This is the second stage of the eclipse, and it's when the moon begins to fully occlude the sun, okay? And this is also the start of totality, which is that really cool part where the corona shows and all the good stuff happens, okay? Now, you also need filtration here. So again, solar filter, solar filter, solar filter. For those of you who are waiting, we'll talk about solar filters at the end. I promise we'll talk about all that equipment stuff, all right? Now, totality, and this is the middle phase of the eclipse. This is when the sun is completely blocked by the moon, and this is where you can see that pretty corona. The photo I've got here, that's just a rendition that I made in PowerPoint. It's not actually look like that. There's a lot more interesting things. It's not that boring, I promise. This is the third stage of the eclipse. This is when the moon is fully occluded, or the sun is fully occluded by the moon, and you can see the corona of the sun, which is amazing, okay? On August 21st, depending on exactly where you live, again, you have to be in that band of totality in order to see it, but depending on where exactly you are in that band, you'll have about 2 minutes and 30 seconds of totality, meaning between second contact and third contact, which we'll talk a little bit. Between those two, you'll have about 2 minutes and 30 seconds to shoot the corona and all the good stuff associated with it. You gotta be quick. It's a pretty speedy thing, so that's why we're gonna talk about this stuff. This little side note, you don't need filtration to shoot totality. If you think about it, the sun is completely blocked by the moon. You don't need any special filters. You can actually look at it with your eyes. But as soon as totality is over, you need it again. So be a little careful. You still want to buy filtration, just to be safe. All right, third contact. Fourth stage of the eclipse. This is the end of totality. The moon is no longer fully occluding the sun. And again, we need filtration. Finally, fourth contact. Fourth contact is the official end of the eclipse. It's the fifth stage, and it's where the moon is completely stops occluding the sun, goes back to normal. So essentially after fourth contact, the sun's back to normal, the eclipse has ended, everything's done. And again, it goes without saying you need filtration again here to look at this stage of the eclipse. So first contact, first connection. Second contact is also the beginning of totality. Totality runs for about 2 minutes and 30 seconds. Then we have third contact where totality is over, and fourth contact where the whole eclipse is over. All right? That's what we can expect. Now, with that said, we need to talk a little bit more about how this all works. So I want to spend some time on equipment. I want to spend some time on exposing and all of those other things. All right? And again, you guys, if you're watching, feel free to ask questions in the comments section or in the little question field over on the right-hand side, I believe it is. Ask questions there. I'm watching. I can answer them. We can also do questions at the end for sure. So let's talk a little bit about equipment. All right? So I want to break this up by type, by thing that you need. All right? Most important thing, well, not the most important thing, one of the most important things is a lens. Obviously, you're not going to be able to shoot much of the eclipse without a good lens. Now, lens selection depends a lot on what you want in the frame. Oh, awesome, we have a question. So Donna's asking how long between first and fourth contact. It actually depends. It's hard to say. It's quite a long time though. Totality is very short because they have to be perfectly aligned. But I'd say you have probably, I'm actually not sure, I've never looked at that. I'd imagine between 30, 45 minutes between first contact and fourth contact. Maybe someone else in the chat knows the answer to that. Unfortunately, I never looked. Totality's been what I'm super excited about. So it's a great question, Donna. Way longer than totality though, I'll tell you that. So lens selection, how much we want in the frame. Now, if you're just looking to capture the sun and you don't care about the corona, I don't know why you wouldn't. I like the corona, but if you don't care about it, you can have a focal length up to 2,000 millimeters. Now, a lot of people are going to say, whoa, 2,000 millimeter lens, that costs like $100,000. That's expensive. Yes, it is. But in the world of telescopes, which is what a lot of people will use to shoot the eclipse, a 2,000 millimeter telescope is actually not that big of a telescope. If you have like a Schmidt-Cassegrain telescope, it's a pretty common focal length is about 2,000 millimeters. So totally doable. And again, don't think lens, think telescope, because most people are going to be shooting one with that. But we'll talk about lenses in a minute. All right. If you want the sun and the corona, you need to keep your focal length under 1,500 millimeters. All right. Oh, perfect. Someone's looking saying it's about 3 hours. So yeah, I'm probably wrong with that. John is also looking for an answer. Yeah, it could be 2 hours, could be 3 hours. I mean, the sun's moving pretty slow through the sky, and the moon's pretty big, so it definitely could be longer than that. It's a great question, Don, and thank you guys for looking at that. If you are looking to capture the sun and the corona, keep it under 1,500 millimeters. You don't want to go longer than that. But you guys, with that said, if you have a 70 to 200 millimeter lens and that's all you have, it's fine. Use that. At least you'll get something, and you can always crop in. And imagine if you have a 70 to 200, that's more room for the corona and the nice dark sky around the sun and all of that pretty stuff as well. So don't feel like you have to have something long. But with that said, if you do want to get something a little longer, using a telescope can be a really cheap way, not cheap, relatively cheap way to get something a little bit longer, okay? Here's a little comparison I want to show you guys between focal lengths. On the upper left, we've got what it would look like with a 200 millimeter lens, and on the bottom right, a 2,000 millimeter lens. So one thing to keep in mind with this, those of you with crop sensor cameras, this is the effective focal length, and you can actually see the ones in blue are for crop sensor, the ones in black are for full frame sensor. So do keep that in mind. With a crop sensor camera, you will be zoomed in a little bit more, so your lenses will act a little bit longer. Oh, look at this. Perfect. Someone has the answer. 2.75 hours between first and fourth contact. So quite a long time out there. That's awesome. Also, we have someone posting the path. Thank you guys so much for posting that in the comments. That's awesome. That's why live streams are cool. Good deal. So focal length stuff, basically you guys use what you have. If you have a 70 to 300 millimeter lens or a 70 to 200, those are going to be great. If you don't have anything 200 millimeters and you have something shorter, it'll be fine. But again, the sun's just going to get smaller and smaller in your frame. So just do keep that in mind. All right, let's talk about cameras now. Pretty much any DSLR is going to be great. I want to say this real quick to start with. I'm approaching this talk as though you guys want to get professional quality images of the eclipse. If you want to shoot it with a cell phone or a point and shoot, we're not going to talk about that in here. I'm assuming that you guys are going to want to use a DSLR. If you do want to use a telescope, or excuse me, a point and shoot or a cell phone, you can look up something called digiscoping, which is using a telescope and an eyepiece and basically attaching your cell phone to it. It's a more advanced technique, but there's a lot of articles out there on how to do that. I'm going to continue assuming we want to use a DSLR, so just keep that in mind as we proceed. Or mirrorless camera for sure. Sarah's reminding me mirrorless. Thanks. All right. Now, because focal length is so important, I would say that a crop sensor camera is actually probably more advantageous in this situation than a full frame one, okay? So do keep that in mind. If you've got both and you're used to using your full frame camera for most everything, I think it's time to bust out that crop sensor camera or use both of them. But giving yourself that extra like 1.6x or 1.5x, or even if you have like an Olympus or a Micro Four Thirds camera, 2x modification or zoom on your lenses would be really, really helpful, okay? If you have a full frame camera, that's also fine. You can always crop into the image if you need to, okay? And it looks like John just posted a map for your state, and you can pick your state and it will tell you the time and the length of every phase of the eclipse. That's awesome. Sweet stuff. So click on that if you need it. All right, let's see. The other thing is there's going to be a lot of available light. In fact, we're going to have to filter out a lot of that light in order to get the proper exposure. So high ISO performance, low light performance, the things that I care a lot about when I'm doing astrophotography are actually not that important because there's just so much light availability when you're shooting the sun. You're shooting what lights up everything. It's awesome. Biggest thing I'd say, you all, pick something you're comfortable with. I would not go buy some fancy schmancy 5D Mark IV, take it out of the box the night before the eclipse and try to use it. Stick to something you know, stick to something you're used to. This isn't the time to be fumbling when you only have 2 hours or 3 hours for the whole thing and about 2 minutes and 30 seconds for totality. You definitely want to keep to something you're familiar with. All right, so that's lenses and cameras. Now, let's move on to solar filters. I think most of us probably have some sort of longer lens if you've been shooting for a while and a camera. But solar filters are something that probably most of us don't have. So I'm going to keep it simple. You need a filter. It's just the way it is. But the good news is, and I think this is really cool for a lot of people, once you buy a filter, you can use it after the eclipse. The sun is a constantly changing orb of light in the sky. It's amazing. The things that happen on it, sunspots and solar flares and all these cool things, they change minute by minute. That's why northern lights are a thing. Like, it's very, very cool what the sun does. So if you invest some money in a filter, especially a nicer one, it's not just the eclipse you'll use it for. You can use it years after for a lot of other things, which is super cool. Now, most solar filters cost between about $25 and $150, but you can also get some that cost more than $1,000. There are some extremely nice filters out there, and I want to talk specifically about what I would recommend. Also, I should say, as we continue through this, there are links in the video description down below to every different product I'm going to talk about in the next 10 or 15 minutes. So if you guys are wondering and you want to buy one or look at it, there's links down there. I'll take you right to what I'm talking about. All right? I will say this, buy your stuff early for two reasons. One, I think a lot of companies are going to run out of stock of a lot of these filters. So if you've got your eye on something that you think you really, really want, get it soon. Second thing, you definitely want to practice. Like I said earlier, the sun right now is no different than it's going to be on eclipse day before the eclipse starts. So figuring out things like exposure and how to put the filter on and how to use it, you can do all of that today, and then you're ready on eclipse day, which I highly recommend because it's cool. It's going to be awesome. All right, last thing with solar filters. Don't forget filters for your eyes. Solar filter goggles are very, very cheap. They look super nerdy. It's awesome. They look like those little 3D goggles from old movies with the little red and the little blue eyeballs, except they're not red and blue. They're really dark. Get a pair of those. Get one for your friends so that you guys can watch it too. Because as you're out there, you're not just going to want to look through your camera. You're also going to want to actually look at it, which is super awesome. We need to make sure that we can do that. Okay? Now, let's talk about the types. You can take solar filters, the world of them, and break them into two separate categories, okay? There are visible light filters, and there are what are called band pass filters. And one of the most common band pass filter is hydrogen alpha, okay? So we've got visible filter and hydrogen alpha filter, or band pass. Let's talk about each in turn. So here's an example of what a visible light filter photograph can get you. You can see there are sunspots there on the right-hand side. Things look cool, there's some detail. Sarah actually made a comment that it kind of looks like an orange, which it definitely does. It's just an orange blob with some little spots, okay? A visible light filter is gonna let all wavelengths of light through it, okay? And all it's gonna do is take that light and it's gonna darken it way, way down, cut a lot of it out. In fact, most visible light solar filters cut out about 16 stops of light, which for those of you, if you're gonna think stops, is about 100,000 times the amount of light that there is to start with. So the sun's emitting a bunch of light, you cut out 100,000 times that amount of light, and that's what that filter is doing for you, okay? Now, like I said, visible light filters allow most wavelengths of light through, and that's why it's visible light. The wavelengths we can see, that's what it's gonna let pass through it. These work great for the eclipse, but they're really not gonna be super cool after the eclipse. Like you can see on the photo on the right, that's pretty much what the sun is always gonna look like through one of these filters, except, you know, the little sunspots will change in location, change in size, things like that. You can watch them dance around the sun over a long time. It's pretty cool. But if you really wanna invest in a filter that will kind of provide you with really amazing views after the fact, I would go with hydrogen alpha. So here's a hydrogen alpha view through that. And you can see, look at the difference in the detail. Here we can really see the surface of the sun, the photosphere, and you can see the dark parts, the light parts. You can see solar flares coming off. What a hydrogen alpha filter is it's much more advanced. It blocks out most of the visible spectrum of light, most of the light we can see, and it only lets a very little skinny band of what's called hydrogen alpha emission light through it, which gives you these amazing views. And the cool thing is most of the best features of the sun, most of the most interesting things, look the best when viewed through hydrogen alpha filtration, which is really, really neat. Now, the neat thing is, the really cool thing is that these filters are gonna be really top-notch during the eclipse because they're gonna give you these views, as you can see on the right-hand side, but they're also gonna give you years of service after the fact because through hydrogen alpha light, the sun is always evolving. You can see all the flares, you can see the evolving photosphere, all of those things. Here's a little comparison. On the left-hand side, we have visible light filtration. On the right-hand side, we have hydrogen alpha, and you can see clear differences between the two of them. So, to summarize, if you're going to make solar photography a hobby of yours, invest the money in a hydrogen alpha setup, whether that's a filter or a telescope or whatever. If you're just here to shoot the eclipse, buy a simple visible light filter. With that, let's look at some options. So, your most basic option, a company called Daystar, and they actually also make the most expensive option, which is kind of funny. A company called Daystar makes their just simple solar filter. It's cardboard, it's got a little filtration on it, very basic. It's simple, it's cheap, it's easy. It's definitely not gonna last as long as some of the more expensive options because it's made of cardboard. But hey, if you're just gonna shoot the eclipse, this is probably perfect. I will say this, they come in a lot of different sizes. So if you are interested in getting one of these, they don't screw into your filter thread, they fit around the outside of your lens. So if you have some big lens, you're gonna wanna measure the distance, the diameter of the front of your lens, not the glass part, not the filter size, but the outside diameter of the front of your lens, because that's what you're gonna need to buy so that it can fit around the front, all right? These cost 20 bucks. If you're not gonna get anything else, get one of these, it'll at least let you shoot the eclipse. Now, let's go one step up. Intermediate level would be something made of glass. Now, this is still a visible light filter, but the difference is that it's a little bit more durable. It's made of glass, it's gonna be sharper, it's gonna be kind of more, you can beat it up, and I can't beat it up, it's glass. But you can be a little bit more rough on it, it will last longer than the cardboard one will. okay? And as well be sharper, like I said. Now these are sized according to your lens's filter size. So here you don't want to measure the outer diameter of your lens. You want to look on the front of your lens and see what the filter size is and get the one that matches. Now, one very important thing with these, if you have a really big Canon or Nikon or mirrorless lens, some of them have back filters, filters that go in the rear of the lens. Be careful with those, because in some cases, if I would basically, by be careful, I mean don't get one of these for those lenses. You really want to have your filter on the front of the lens, because otherwise that sun is going to be beaming through all of your pieces of glass until it gets to the filter at the very back of the lens, and that can cause some damage. So we're assuming that filters are going to go on the front. Essentially, fairly simple. These filters are called a lot of different things. Sometimes they're called ND 5.0, sometimes they're called ND 100,000, sometimes they're called solar filters. There's a lot of names for them. They cost about 125 bucks. But do keep in mind, the view, the image that you are going to get through the cardboard version and the glass version is very little difference. It's not going to be a huge difference. They're still both visible light filters. The only thing you're gaining with the glass one is a little bit of sharpness and a little bit of durability. All right? Now, let's jump up a big step. Let's start talking about an actual hydrogen alpha filter, or in this case, telescope. This is called the Coronado PST, which stands for Personal Solar Telescope, which I think is incredibly nerdy, but I owned one and it was awesome. I loved this thing. This little guy is actually a filter and a telescope in one unit. So if you don't have a long lens and you don't have a solar filter, this is a way you can actually get both in one product, which definitely adds some value. The one thing to think about with this, though, is it's only useful for the sun. So this is not a telescope that you can remove the filter from. This is a dedicated solar telescope. It's only for solar observations. So if you're wanting to get something for, say, looking at the stars, this isn't going to work for you. These cost about $600, which honestly, if you're looking to get into this whole thing, is a darn bargain. It's a really good, cheap way to do it that will do a really good job. Because again, it's hydrogen alpha, so you'll get those beautiful, beautiful images of the sun. One thing I should say on these, because I owned one, do expect to pay about $50 extra for some adapters in order to mount your DSLR to this telescope. Because it's made to use with eyepieces, you'll need to do a slight modification in order to make it work with a DSLR. If you're interested in that, there are a lot of articles on Google. You can just Google like Coronado PST with a DSLR, and there's a lot of people who've outlined exactly what they did in order to use it. So it's a great way to do it. Now, with that said, let's get into the professional stuff. This little guy on the right is actually made by Daystar, the same company that makes the cardboard filter. And this is by far the most advanced way to shoot the Eclipse. This actually goes between your lens and your camera, so it's a rear filter, but it lets you use any lens you want to, which is amazing, because if you have a 300 or a 400 or a 70-200, any of those will work on this filter. Now, you need to check their website. Check out Daystar's website, and again, a link to this is in the description. You need to check their website, because some lenses have too big of a front objective, front piece of glass. They let too much light in, and you actually have to put a pre-filter on the front of the lens before it gets to this thing. Because like I said earlier, this goes in the middle there. So all that unprotected sunlight is going all the way through your lens before it gets to the filter. On some lenses, that's fine. On others, it's not. So check their website before you pay the money. This is by far the most advanced way to do it. But if you're going to do this way, you already need a long lens, and you got to have a DSLR in order to do it. So, great option, but you got to have that stuff. Hands down, this is going to provide the best view of the sun, both before, during, and after the eclipse. But costs $1,100. So you got to be ready to shell out a lot of money and be really ready to get into this if this is what you want to do. So there we go. We got the gamut. $20 on the low end, all the way up to 1100 or above on the high end. Those are our filters we can use. Now, another thing that I want to talk about that's very important is if you want to remove something for you to have to do, make your life a little easier on Eclipse Day, I would look at getting yourself a tracking mount. Now, very quick disclaimer, this is by no means required. You can totally shoot the Eclipse without a tracking mount. You need a solar filter, but you can shoot it without a tracking mount. Just do keep in mind the sun is moving, so you're going to need to loosen your ball head or whatever tripod head you have, recompose, tighten every so often as the sun moves through the sky. A tracking mount is going to do that for you, okay? It's going to keep the sun in the frame throughout the duration of the eclipse, which is super cool. You can focus on just shooting, enjoying it, being there. The other thing that should be said, I have a lot of students who in the past have expressed a lot of interest in astrophotography. They've wanted to get into astrophotography, they've wanted to shoot the stars, and they've needed a reason to buy a mount. This might be a reason. The Eclipse is a once-in-a-lifetime kind of thing. If you're looking to buy a tracking mount, something you buy that's good for the Eclipse is also going to be good for astrophotography, which in my opinion, if you've been waiting for a reason to get into astrophotography, this is probably that reason that I would say is the reason to do it. A simple tracker can cost as little as 300 bucks. They're pretty cheap, they're pretty nice. I know that's not cheap for some people, but I've been in the world of astronomy for a long time. That's cheap when it comes to astrophotography gear. This stuff can go thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars. So let's look at some options. The cheapest one I would recommend is called the iOptron Sky Tracker Pro. I own the previous version of this. I love it. I've taken it with me to lots of different states, wherever I go anywhere. It's awesome. It's a great thing. Actually, hey, Ken has a question. Does the hydrogen alpha act as a magnifier extension tube? Depends on the filter you get, Ken. So that little telescope has about a 400 millimeter focal length, that Coronado PST. The Daystar filter, the $1,100 or $1,200 one, has I think it's a 4x magnification in it, built in. So it makes all your lenses quite a bit longer, but you'll have to check the manufacturer for the exact numbers. But yes, a lot of them do, because they understand that your DSLR lenses are fairly short when put against telescopes and things like that. So that's a great question. iOptron Sky Tracker is awesome. Now, what this is going to do for you is this is going to give you very basic tracking. It's going to be very straightforward, very light, very small. Again, I take it with me everywhere I go. It's awesome. With my Coronado PST and my DSLR, I had no issues using this. It was a beautiful setup. I could set everything up, let it sit, and it would just sit there and track the sun throughout the day, which was really, really cool. One thing to keep in mind, the Sky Tracker and the next one we look at don't have what's called go-to functionality. Now, go-to functionality means for astrophotography that you can get out there in the middle of the night and you can program in your mount, go to the Andromeda galaxy. And you might have no knowledge of the sky or where anything is, but the telescope slews, which is the fancy term for moves, and it just goes and points itself at the Andromeda galaxy. So for astrophotographers, this is not going to give you that. You have to point it at what you want, and then once you point it and lock it down, it will track and stay with that object. But it's $300, which for a mount like this, it's a steal. It's a really, really good deal. Problem with it is, if you want to use a lens that's longer than maybe a 70 to 200, in fact, even a 70 to 200 on this little mount is pushing it a little bit, it's not going to do great for bigger lenses. And that's where the one step up its older brother comes in, which is the iOptron Sky Guider. This is a little bit more expensive. It's honestly the same functionality. All it adds is a little bit more weight. You can see it has a counterweight at the bottom of it on the other side of the lens, and that helps balance the load, and it helps it handle a heavier payload. So this can handle up to 11 pounds with camera and lens and all of your equipment included. So if you've got a 300 or a 70 to 200 that's one of the f2.8 big heavy ones, this might be the right choice to go for, okay? But again, same capabilities. It still doesn't have go-to functionality. It still doesn't have that stuff. But it's $450. So for an extra $150, you get a lot of more weight capabilities, okay? So those are the simple ones. Now, if astrophotography is something that you want to get into more seriously, I might go with something a little bit larger like a Celestron AVX. Now, the A stands for advanced, so it's the Celestron Advanced VX. This is really an entry-level astrophotography mount. Like, you can do legit full-blown astrophotography with this thing. All right, it does cost $900, so the expense goes way up, but this has go-to. This has the functionality to go to the Whirlpool galaxy, and it goes and points at the Whirlpool galaxy in the middle of the night, which is amazing. And if you don't have a knowledge of the sky that's super thorough, this is super, super helpful. It's really nice. If you already have an interest in astrophotography and you want to shoot the eclipse, I would probably go with this. I think it's the best choice all around to just get one thing and stay with it forever, okay? Now, let's break this down. Camera and lens, use whatever you have. Solar filter, 2 options. You can go visible or you can go hydrogen alpha, or band pass as it's known. On the simple end, spend $20, you'll be happy. You don't need a tracking mount. I just wanted to talk about them because some people will want that convenience. If you do want to get a tracking mount and you have, say, a Canon 300mm lens, get yourself the Sky Guider, the one step up. Be a great mount. You can do astrophotography with it. You can do everything with it, and I think it would suit you very, very well. But you don't need a mount. It's just a convenience thing completely. One more thing. A cable release or an interval timer. You don't want to be pushing the button on your camera every time you take a picture. And you probably also don't want to use self-timer, because every time you push the button, it's going to shake the camera and it's going to make your pictures a little bit more blurry. So get a cable release or an interval timer. These cost literally like $15 to $20, and they'll save you so much headache and pain down the line, especially if you have a mount. You get your mount set up and it's all pretty and everything's great, and then you push the button on the camera and it misaligns the mount and it's a big pain. Cable release, little cord, click it really easily. It's awesome. Get one of these. That's equipment. All right, so that's kind of what you need. Very, very simply, camera, lens, solar filter, and an optional tracking mount. With all of that said, the last thing I want to talk about, or almost the last thing, is exposure, okay? Now, I need to give some huge credit to some people out there on the internet, and I've linked all of them down below in the description. There is a huge team of solar eclipse photographers who are incredible, and they've put all of this information on the web for free. So huge props to them. They're really, really great. We're going to use a lot of their stuff here in the next few minutes as we talk about exposing. Now, someone's asking a question here. With SkyTracker, how do you align it properly for the first time if you have to aim the camera initially? So Austin, the way you do this is you actually align the SkyTracker to the North Star before you put the mount on, or the camera on it at all. Now, North Star is obviously not visible in the daytime. So you can also kind of get it roughly aligned. The nice thing about mounts is if you're trying to track something as big as the sun, even a rough alignment is going to be way better than no tracking at all. My plan personally is actually to head down the night before the eclipse, get all of my mounts aligned to the North Star, turn them off, leave them aligned and weighted down, go to sleep, and in the morning, I'll have everything aligned and ready to go for the eclipse day. So you can do that, or a rough alignment will still be way better than not having a tracking mount at all. But that's a great question. You align it first, then you put the camera on it and aim the camera, and it will stay aligned once you put the camera on top. It's the way it works. It's awesome. All right, getting the exposure right. I'd say this is going to be one of the biggest challenges. I think this is probably the biggest hurdle for a lot of people to do on eclipse day. Huge recommendation I would have. Buy your equipment early. Get your filter here this week or next week. Get any gear you're going to have, because like I've said multiple times, you can practice on the sun tomorrow and it's going to look the same as it will right before the eclipse. So practicing putting your solar filter on, taking it off, figuring out what exposure is correct, all that stuff, do it ahead of time. Now, the biggest problem here is that the exposure is going to change dramatically between first contact and totality. There's a huge difference in exposure between the two of them. It's really bad. In fact, the corona, that cool filamentary structure on the outside of the sun, is 1,000,000 times darker than the photosphere, the surface. That's a lot. So getting your exposure in bracketing is really, really important. And that's the next thing. I would really recommend bracketing. Those of you who don't know, bracketing is where you have your camera set so that every time you click the shutter, it takes a series of exposures, brighter and darker, and right on what you have it set to. So for every one click of the shutter, it takes multiple photographs at different exposures to be sure you get the correct one. I guarantee you, I've been shooting for a lot of years, since I was 7. I am going to be bracketing the heck out of the Eclipse because I don't want to miss something because I was a little bit too dark or a little bit too bright, okay? Let's see. My Own Eyes is saying that Photo Pills is great to find star locations using a phone app. Yes, there's an app out there, you guys, called Photo Pills. It's excellent. It helps you find where stars are. There's really a lot of good planetarium programs. Stellarium is one for the computer that's super cool. If you want to navigate the night sky and get good at it, there's a lot of stuff out there for you. All right, so with exposing, let's use a chart. And again, I did not make this. Full credit goes to, his name's Fred. I'm going to butcher this, but I think it's Espinac. He owns a website called MrEclipse.com. He made this. It's fantastic. Let's walk through it. So here's a chart. And again, it's linked in the description. His website is. What we want to do first with this chart, because it looks confusing, is decide on what ISO we want to use. So I'm going to say, hey, I have decided that for this eclipse, I'm going to use ISO 200. Brilliant. We get our camera all set. We're there on eclipse day. Put our ISO on 200. Done. You can see there we've highlighted it. Now, from there, using this chart, we go over on the row for ISO 200. And we can see there's a number of highlighted f-stops on that row. Now that we've picked ISO 200, we pick an f-stop that we want to use for the day. My lens that I'm going to shoot with personally is f5.6, and I want to shoot wide open. I want to let as much light in through my aperture as I can, so I'm going to decide that f5.6 is the aperture of my choice. So we're ISO 200, we're at f5.6. You'll do whatever your lens and whatever your favorite ISO is for the day. Now here's where it gets easy. We now go straight down from f5.6, and it gives us the shutter speed that we need to use for each of these different things. Now, let's go through these. The very top one where it says partial, that's for the actual sun, shooting the sun during the partial eclipse, meaning between first contact and second contact, or between third contact and fourth contact. See, terminology. That's why I taught it to you. Now you know what that means. That's for those durations. Now, it should be said, notice that it says partial dash 5.0 ND. This is assuming that you have a solar filter on your lens. So this isn't unfiltered, the shutter speed. That's the shutter speed with a ND 100,000 or 5.0 or 16 stop, however you want to call it, filter on the front of your lens. And we can see that 1/2000th of a second gives us a rough idea of what we should use. Now, let's say that second contact has just happened and we enter totality, okay? You can see that the corona exposures vary greatly. Now let me explain this. You can see that I have corona 0.1 R sun. R sun is the radius of the sun. So if we think of the sun and we have a circle there, the radius is the little chunk right here. The corona, the brightness of the corona, at 1/10 of a radius away from the edge of the sun, meaning the very closest part of the corona to the sun, we need to be at an exposure of 1/1000th of a second. Now you guys and gals and everyone watching, that is unfiltered. So that means you take the filter off because this is during totality. And like I said earlier, during totality, we don't use filtration. So 1/1000th of a second gets the closest corona properly exposed. You can see at 1 solar radii, we're at 1/15 of a second, and check this out. At 8 solar radii, so out toward the edge of the corona, we're at an exposure or a shutter speed at 1 second long. So the corona, the cool filamentary structure, varies in brightness from a correct exposure of 1/1000th of a second to 1 second. That is amazing. So I would say take a whole series of exposures from one to the other, varying by maybe a stop at a time, to get every part of the corona properly exposed. Okay, so let's walk through exactly what I just said. And again, your numbers will be different depending on what ISO and what aperture you decide to use. So from the chart, we're going to say we're going to use ISO 200, 5.6 with a filter. We can expect to be at 1/2000th of a second for first through second contact, that whole first phase of the eclipse. Once the sun reaches totality, we're going to remove the filter, and then we're going to shoot a series of exposures from 1 second to 1/1000th of a second to get the entire corona sharp. Again, we're staying at f5.6 and we're staying at ISO 200 through all of this. We're only changing the shutter speed as we go, okay? And then lastly, we would replace the filter, go back to the original exposure settings, and shoot third contact through fourth contact. That's all there is to it. So there are definitely more different pieces of the sun that you can expose correctly. There's a bigger version of this chart. This is kind of the simplified version. So definitely check out the Mr. Eclipse website down below if you want the full chart. But this is the most important things that I find was the corona and then a proper exposure of the surface. But that's how easy it is. Super simple. Like, I just fed you the exposure. You program everything in your camera and go to town. Bracketing all the way, okay? Let's see, we got a question. Will this chart be available for us to refer to? It will, Donna. What I would do, I don't have a printable version because I didn't make it. I don't want to take credit for it. But if you go to that Mr. Eclipse website down in the video description, he has a version that you can PDF print, I believe. If he doesn't, you can just run a Google search for solar eclipse exposure chart, and you're going to find the same thing over and over and over again in a nice PDF printable form. So for sure, you can do that. I just didn't make one because I didn't want to steal someone else's work. I just wanted to show it to you guys. All right. So with that said, that gets us to focusing. Actually, one more thing, Donna, I wanted to remind you of, tell you, there are a lot of apps out there for your phone that will actually, you can input what lens you're using, where you are, all of those different things, and it will actually tell you the right exposure for all of the different stages of eclipse. So there's actually apps that people have built to take that chart and digitize it for you. So you could look at those as well. That might be an even fancier, cooler way to do it. Either way works. All right. Let's talk about focusing. We're almost there. With focusing, you guys, autofocus is going to have a very hard time. But the nice thing is, the sun is not getting any closer or further as it moves around the sky. So if you get your focus correct at one point, it will stay correct through the entirety of the eclipse. So what I would say is, before first contact even happens, flip your lens to manual focus. Put on your solar filter, point up at the sun, and put your camera in live view. Most every camera these days have live view. Mirrorless cameras, you're always in live view. If you don't know how to get to live view, look in your instruction manual. If you don't have it, it's gonna be a little hard to do this, but you can there's other techniques to use too. You can Google those. But if you do, put your camera in live view, and then when you're in live view, there's a little button you can hit to zoom in, and it will zoom in on the screen. You're looking at the screen on your camera. It will digitally zoom in to what you're looking at, and zoom in to the edge of the sun. Twist the manual focus ring on your lens, and again, you actually need to switch your camera to manual focus. Twist that manual focus ring until the sun's edge looks super sharp. And then I would say, bring with you some gaffer's tape or duct tape or masking tape. Rip off a piece of tape and tape that focus ring down. You don't want it to move, because once you get focus at the beginning, you don't need it to change again. As soon as you've got focus, tape that puppy down, you're good to go. If you don't have live view, you can try autofocus. You might have some issues. If If you don't want to use autofocus, you could also just manually focus looking through the viewfinder, but you might have a bit of a hard time. I think live view will probably be the best way to go. All right. Overall, practice, practice, practice. You guys, there's no reason you can't get all of your gear ahead of time. Go outside on a bright sunny day and run through the entire sequence of events just like you're going to do on Eclipse Day. That's what I'm going to do. I'm going to run through it multiple times because I want to be so well versed with all of the steps that are involved that I can actually have a minute or so of totality to just sit and look around, because I really have heard amazing things about what it's like to be in an eclipse. So I want to make it second nature so that I'm good to go. All right. Yes, I love it. Bruce, not duct tape. Use gaffer's tape. I just said duct tape because some people don't know what gaffer's tape is. Use gaffer's tape or masking tape. Use a tape that doesn't leave sticky residue. Bruce is spot on. Duct tape's bad. Practice. Couple last things. Been doing some reading. A lot of people are saying that traffic could get a little bit rough on the day of the eclipse, okay? So if you are planning on shooting this, and here's a little map of kind of what to expect. Leave earlier than you think you're going to leave. I'm gonna leave, like I said, the night before to get all my mounts aligned and everything ready. Especially if you live in the southeastern United States, there's gonna be a lot of traffic. A lot of the metropolitan areas are right near there, and there's just a lot of stuff, okay? With the traffic, this little map you guys are seeing on the screen right now, an awesome team of people looked at the US, it might have even been one person, looked at the US and mapped out where all the major metropolitan areas were in the US. And they looked at the roads that someone would need to take from one of those metropolitan areas to the path of totality, that cool path across the US that gets a total solar eclipse. And you can see all of the red roads are the roads that they're predicting are gonna have the most traffic. So if you live in one of those areas, watch out. I've planned Sarah and I's route super carefully to avoid these areas, but hopefully everyone else hasn't planned the same way as I did, because then it would have backfired on me. But anyway, planning ahead can be super helpful. Ken is asking any thoughts on doing a time lapse. Ken, that's a great question. I'm actually gonna have one camera pointing at the sun, and I'm gonna have a second camera with a wide angle lens getting the whole scene in, because I really wanna have a cool time lapse of me out there putting my filters on with my family and just having fun. So that's a great thought. You will want a solar filter if you're gonna use a longer lens for the time lapse, if the sun is a major part of your photo, just to not damage your camera in any way, okay? So that is how we shoot a solar eclipse, you guys. I wanna thank you all for watching this. I hope you found it helpful. A couple little things. First of all, if there's any questions, leave them behind. If I don't get to all of them tonight, I promise I'll answer them in the comments section. But I want to thank you guys. I also want to say this. We have been really putting a lot of effort into our YouTube channel on RMSP. If you guys haven't subscribed already, I'd love you to hit that subscribe button right down below this. Also, that like button is super appreciated too. That'll help this video grow up there in the search results. And you all, one thing I will say about our videos, we definitely do post marketing videos every once in a while, but we're mostly content. I really care a lot about giving you guys really, really valuable content on our YouTube channel that you can watch and learn things and figure things out, and that is super helpful. So thank you guys for watching. I really appreciate it. I'll get to your comments and questions as we go. If you're watching this recorded, I'll get to it within a day or so of posting it, and thank you guys so much for watching our video.